chair in the Interdisciplinary Program in Arts and Humanities at UT Dallas and recently appointed art critic for the Dallas Morning News. Dr. Brettell is passionate about the integration of academic and museum research and teaching and has spent his entire professional life straddling both spheres. He's taught at the University of Texas, Northwestern University, the University of Chicago, Yale, and Harvard. Dr. Brettell's museum career began in 1980 when he was appointed Searle Curator of European Painting at the Art Institute of Chicago. 8 years later, he became the McDermott Director of the Dallas Museum of Art, where he oversaw the addition and endowment of the Hammond Building, which opened in 1993. Since leaving the DMA, Dr. Brettell has maintained a strong presence in the museum world, serving in curatorial roles and authoring exhibition catalogs, as well as serving on museum boards across the country and internationally. Dr. Brettell is among the foremost authorities in the world on Impressionism and French painting from 1830 to 1930. Some of his recent publications include Pizarro's People for the 2012 exhibition at San Francisco's Legion of Honor, as well as 2 texts authored in conjunction with exhibitions at the Kimball, one titled From the Private Collections of Texas, European Art, Ancient to Modern, published in 2009, and another titled Gauguin and Impressionism, published in 2005. For an exhibition at the Metropolitan in 2006, he also published 19th and 20th century European drawings in the Lehman collection, and these are just a few. Dr. Brettell has also been appointed the director of the Paul Gauguin Catalogue Raisonné for the Wildenstein Institute in Paris and was named Commander of Arts and Letters by the French Minister of Culture for his work within the French Regional American Museum Exchange. The Meadows Museum was delighted when Dr. Brettell expressed his interest in writing on Sorolla in America for the forthcoming April issue of Burlington Magazine. His expertise on the art of this period and his interest in Sorolla is the reason we've invited him here tonight to address the subject of the Masters of the Loaded Brush in his lecture titled Sorolla and Cosmopolitan Painting in Europe and America, 1870 to 1920. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rick Brettell.
Thank you very much. I think if we can get rid of lights, particularly on me, the older and fatter I get, the less I want to be lit. I'm talking about Sorolla, but I'm talking about Sorolla in a very big, broad context. And in fact, this is going to be a kind of visual orgy, if you'll permit that vulgarism, because you're going to see lots and lots and lots and lots of images. And the reason you're going to see lots and lots and lots of images is that Sorolla is best understood in a context which really can't be experienced in any single museum. And that was made clear to me when I became curator of European paintings at Chicago in 1980, and like all curators, the first thing you do is you go into storage to find out what everybody, nobody has seen. And one of the first paintings I saw in storage was this painting, which is upstairs in the exhibition, and which was bought by the Art Institute, or given to the Art Institute in 1911 on the occasion of the Sorolla exhibition, and had been in storage in the Art Institute since 1930. And we were talking 1980, so for 50 years it had been in storage. I knew almost nothing at that point in my career with a PhD from Yale and all sorts of fancy teaching at UT Austin about Sorolla. So therefore I looked at this spectacular painting, and it was unframed. It just was on a rack and it was unframed, and so I looked up Sorolla and figured out what to do, and then went to frame storage, another room, and found this fantastic frame, which was the original frame for the painting, but they'd been separated long ago, and so I put them together and put it up for the first time in 50 years, and began to think more about this extraordinary man. I found that he not only had had an exhibition at the Art Institute in 1911, which now we know everything about thanks to the Meadows wonderful exhibition, but also that he taught briefly at the Art Institute with a translator, because his English, in spite of his numerous trips, was not really so good. And that he had a big effect, actually, on Chicago school painters and on collectors in Chicago, and that his friendships throughout the art world also kind of reverberated throughout Chicago, and that's kind of what I want to talk about today. The next time I saw a Sorolla exhibition was a bizarre and interesting and really great exhibition, which I don't know whether any of you saw. I'm sure Mark saw it. I mean, I saw it in Paris, and it was Sorolla Sargent. And it was at the Petit Palais in Paris. I didn't even know that it was going to happen. I was just in Paris because I'm lots in Paris, and I went to see it. And it was a fantastic exhibition because it was installed so that no Sorolla was ever next to a Sargent and no Sargent was ever next to a Sorolla, but there were little rooms alternating of each of their paintings. And I show two of them, the one that you know from upstairs, the wonderful portrait of Clotilde sitting on the yellow sofa, which is one of Sorolla's most beautiful and intimate portraits of his wife. And of course, Sargent didn't have a wife, so he couldn't paint her. So he painted Lady Agnew at Lochnair, a Scottish country house. And we see one of the most beautiful dark-haired women in the history of the world sitting in a chair remarkably similar to that of Clotilde and looking directly at the viewer in a way which is in some ways more conventional in terms of pictorial structure than the Sorolla. And that's because Sorolla was painting his wife and he was painting it for himself, and Sargent was painting it for the sitter. And therefore he had to paint it like she wanted it. She chose the dress, she chose the chair, and she's looking right into his eyes as if she wants to take him away. And unfortunately, he wasn't into that, so that didn't happen. What I'm going to do now is to talk about a group of artists, a little kind of baker's dozen of painters that have always interested me. And I've made a few too many. When I thought about doing this lecture, I thought of reducing it to the really good friends of Sorolla, and that they would be Zorn, Sargent, and Boldini. But I thought, well, really there were other painters that are like this, and other painters that slipped between one place and another, that existed in terms of their patronage and in terms of their financial career by painting portraits of fancy people and important people, but who also painted a whole series of other things, lived astride the two centuries, the 19th and the 20th century, and I list them for you here today. We have Sorolla, let's see, and Sargent, and I put their dates. Boldini, who they each knew very well. You can see that they're born different dates. Jacques-Émile Blanche, who's a painter who was one of the most famous painters in France at the same period of time, and who now is almost completely unknown, even in France. And you'll be surprised by that. Helleu, who was one of the best friends of Sargent and was therefore in this little circle. Mancini, who's an artist I've gotten to know, Antonio Mancini, an artist from Italy, who spent an enormous amount of time in France and Great Britain, and was also a master of the loaded brush, and also knew of these other artists, particularly Sargent. Sargent is the one who links them most. And then William Orpen. Have any of you ever heard of Orpen? Oh, that's good. I'm happy. Orpen is an Irish artist who painted rich people in England. And he was a kind of left-wing, crazy, alcoholic Irishman who had entrance because he was charming to all the drawing rooms of London. And he painted these sort of savage portraits of rich people in England, being an Irishman, and I thought you would enjoy seeing them. And he also painted himself quite a lot, which is also interesting. Then two Russians, Repin and Serov, two painters who I love and who are very similar to the others. And I put in Vuillard as a kind of control because, as you know, I work on French avant-garde art, and none of these people are French avant-garde artists. And so I put one in, and I put him in largely because he was really only avant-garde for the first 10 years of his life, and then he became a cosmopolitan portrait painter like all the rest of them, and I want to make the case for you of that. And then finally Anders Zorn, the great Swedish artist, who is being celebrated right now. I think it actually just closed with a huge exhibition at the Fine Arts Museum in San Francisco. And if we had all had our private jets, we could have gone back and forth between the glorious Sorolla exhibition here and the exhibition, monographic exhibition of his very good friend from the other end of Europe, the Swedish artist Anders Zorn. Now, I'm going to show you works by all of them in succession in several categories. And the first I want to deal with like really powerful people, because they dealt very seriously with people who were amongst the wealthiest and most powerful and oftentimes titled people in their countries. And this is an aspect which we know of Sorolla because of the exhibition upstairs, because of the portrait of the king and queen, and also because of the portraits of wealthy Americans. This big portrait of one of the richest Spanish families who was in the diplomatic world and who was so rich that their children were painted by a good many of the artists that we see. And you're going to see two more Aruzarez portraits in this lecture by two other artists. And it doesn't really make you love them, does it? You know, they were obviously good at having children, and they did that with great, and the children were attractive, and they sit sort of posed and stone-faced looking at you in a rather Spanish, austere manner. He's obviously thinking about Velázquez. All of these artists think about Velázquez. And they all have Velázquez on the brain. And this is a great, big society portrait, which is one of the most ambitious portraits of his career. It's a portrait that we don't have anything quite like upstairs in the exhibition. And then, not to be outdone, Sargent gets the commission to paint the ninth Duke of which one is it? Marlborough. And his wife, the great beauty from the United States, Consuela Vanderbilt, and their children. And that painting, which is on the left, is in the same room of Blenheim Castle as the Reynolds portrait of the fourth Duke of Marlborough. And so that we can see a kind of succession of monumental portraits. And one can also see that Sargent, in painting the English aristocracy and an American gazillionaire, painted in a tradition that was very important and that actually has a lot to do with old master painting. And then we have Boldini. Boldini painted kings and queens, and Boldini also painted one of the Aruzarez girls. This girl on the right is... Oops. It's this one. This girl. And here we see her a few years later in Paris, looking spectacular with an incredible dress, a great fan, and a very elegant piece of furniture, and one of the most seductive and beautiful portraits of a young Spanish woman who spoke German, English, French, and Spanish, and was completely at home in the same cosmopolitan society as all of these artists. Ella was fascinating because even though he knew all these rich people, he never painted them. And he painted his wife as if she was a rich person. And this is a psychologically fascinating thing, and we'll get to him in a bit. This is Antonio Mancini, and Antonio Mancini is an artist who very few Americans have heard of because we have very few paintings in the United States by him. There are several in a great private museum in Florida called the Gilgore Collection in Naples, Florida, where I bet my bottom dollar that none of you have been. And there is actually the most popular painting at the Art Institute in the whole first half of the 20th century was a painting by Mancini that I'll show you later. If you think that Sorolla and Sargent and Zorn were masters of the loaded brush, they haven't got anything compared to Mancini, because Mancini's paintings can be up to an inch thick in paint, and he painted with string grids embedded in the painting, and the paintings overtake these grids as he works on them. And one sees, oh, I'm sorry, that's Orpin. One sees an Italian aristocrat on the left in a life-size painting that is literally a half an inch thick. It's still in the family collection. And this is a young Scottish aristocrat at his home. And so we see that Mancini, too, goes to all these places. This is William Orpin, and you can see why I find him so seductive. He's the great painter of sort of frigid British beauties of the period of time in spectacular clothes. And unlike Mancini, his surfaces are very dry, but he operated in the same way, in the same kind of international world, but centered in London rather than in Paris. Then the Russians are less well known to us, and you really have to go to Russia to see the paintings because there are so few of them in the United States. And now, even when one comes up outside of Russia, the Russians buy it back. So it's very difficult for us to see them. And the first of them is the most famous painter in Russia in the second half of the 19th century, Repin, who actually had his country house in Finland and lived in St. Petersburg and painted people like the Tsar and a woman who looks like a very well-dressed streetwalker, but who happens to be a duchess on the right. And again, this sort of playing above one's rank with figures. This is Serov, and Serov is my favorite Russian painter. And Serov painted aristocrats in this kind of blasé, frank, wonderful quality. You know that woman on the left is just poisonously horrible. And, you know, the hat, and what could you say to her, and she's horrible. And, is the man ever going to get on the horse? There's this sense in which Serov paints these people in ways that they accept them because these are commissioned portraits, and yet is almost savage in his visual criticism of them. And then Vuillard. I mean, who thinks of Vuillard as a portrait painter? But Vuillard was the most important painter of rich assimilated Jews in history. And they come from all over the world and all over Europe, and they live in Paris, and he paints them. And we see Mr. David Vey on the left, and one of the Natasson wives on the right in commissioned portraits from the 1920s, the early 1920s. So one can see that Vuillard is in this same world of power. And then Zorn, who paints a real king. This is the king of Sweden, Karl V or whatever his name was on the left by Zorn. And on the right is the queen of Chicago, Bertha Potter Palmer, who was about as far from a queen as you could get, but who wanted to look like one. And Zorn painted her to look like one in this glorious portrait in the Art Institute of Chicago. So we can see all of these artists dealing with people of enormous power. Now, what's interesting is they all also dealt with people with no power and with worlds that are very apart from that. And these pictures are fascinating too. Here are two beautiful Jacques-Émile Blanche. There are a series of almost 30 pictures by Blanche, which show women in mirrors and deal with women in windows and mirrors, and that use his wife or various models in them. And then his still lifes are to die. And this is a little still life which is in a private collection in Dallas, and I'm not going to tell you who owns it, and it's not mine, by Jacques-Émile Blanche. And then Boldini. I mean, Boldini is an Italian, but you want Spanish, I'll give you Spanish. You want still lifes, I'll give you still lifes. And look at those three still lifes. They're completely bonkers and original and fantastic. That's not a detail down below, it's the still life. And the one in the middle is not cut off, that's the way it is. And the one on the right, it's as if he hurled the apples through paint. And they're sort of coming out of the canvas as you look at it. And the sort of sexy Spaniard with her guitar thing pointing right in the right direction and him looking at her, and it's all, not very subtle, but very much low, very unlike Mrs. Aruzara's and the Countess that we saw before. Or Helleu painting his wife, or beautiful young girls, or hydrangeas. He loved hydrangeas. And he painted them always, never in water, always down and flat, and as if they're sort of posing for him like the beautiful women. This is the painting. The picture on the left is a life-size pastel in a private collection in London, which is one of the most beautiful works of art you've ever seen. On the right is Mancini, the most popular picture in the Art Institute, called Morning Sun. And you can see that it's morning sun on a particularly delicious lady with her nipple just bared. And on the left, another particularly delicious lady in these kind of soft-core porn pictures of women by a man who was probably gay, but he made a lot of money painting these. And then Orpen, my God, Orpen makes these models. One is the angler and the other is the girl with the hat. And they're pictures that have no clear social status. These are not women who we want to think of as being powerful. They're women who we want to think of as being seductive, and Orpen paints them that way. Or Rapine, who paints children as well as Renoir does, and who will pose one of the serfs on a family property as if she was a duchess, wearing her normal clothing and having picked flowers from the field and looking at us with this kind of wholesome ordinariness. This is Sargent, too, painted low people, or people who were not posing, or people whose names we do not know. And this courting both of power and of anonymity is intrinsic to the reputations of all these artists, Sorolla included. This is Seraph in a big pastel of his wife, actually, who's getting up in the morning looking out the window of their dacha, and the woman next door at the dacha in the country. And of course, Sorolla is one of the great dog portraits in human history. This wonderful Jack Russell, and an early picture painted as a kind of academy. And one has to think of Sorolla, so high and low is a big deal in Sorolla's career, as we see before. And this is, we are painting sort of ordinary people in big ways, and we don't know who they are, and we don't know why he painted them, and we don't know really what they mean. And Zorn, who loved the people of his native Sweden and who painted them, the rural people of his native Sweden, with the same kind of bravura brushwork which was usually reserved for the wealthy. Now, the other thing they did, not only people of power and not only people without power in their humanistic world, but the collection of famous people, the collection of people who you can say, I've painted so-and-so, and so-and-so was painted by me, or so-and-so, the famous person, can say, I was painted by one of the people. And so I'm going to show you a series of famous people, and one could do an entire exhibition of portraits by all of these guys of famous Europeans and Americans, and it would be some of the great portraits of the last centuries. Here I'm going to show you 3 slidefuls of paintings by Jacques-Émile Blanche because he's so underrated and so little known. This is Les Six with Darius Milhaud and Poulenc and all the other great composers. This is Stravinsky dressed, to kill, going on a little stroll. This is Percy Grainger. Has anybody ever thought of painting Percy Grainger? And Percy Grainger had the most gorgeous hair, and obviously Blanche loved it. Or writers. I mean, who could say that they painted James Joyce, André Gide, Marcel Proust, and Henry James, besides Jacques-Émile Blanche, who knew all of them, and they all came to his house, and they all sat for him. Or artists, and this is another weird collection of artists. We have Aubrey Beardsley, Shannon and Ricketts, the English printmakers, and Degas, who is Jacques-Émile Blanche's closest friend in the end of his life. Boldini, too. This is another Ruzeriz. I have to put them in because they're so spectacular. This is another daughter, and she's amazing in her Boldini guise. And here we see Montesquieu, the dandy to end, the most famous dandy of the 19th century in Paris. And this is Giuseppe Verdi in a pastel, which I show you big because it's so gorgeous and because we all have to get out of here in time to go hear the Verdi Requiem tonight at the DSO. At least I have to be there on time. And this is the greatest portrait of Verdi by his countryman Giovanni Boldini. And Mancini, too. Mancini, this is a gorgeous portrait by Mancini of John Singer Sargent. And this is the wealthiest and most important collector of Impressionists in London and Dublin, Hugh Lane, whose pictures are now alternating between Dublin and London. And this is Mrs. Phillips of the Phillips collection in Washington. So even Mancini, too, courts fame. And here we have Orpen. Orpen can be so savage, and he was even obviously the young Winston Churchill had plenty to drink at lunch before he came and slouched into the studio. And then the most savage society lady ever. And her name is Lady Rock Savage, and she gave the best parties in London, and she was the sort of Pearl Mesta of London at the period of time, and she was also Jewish and was gorgeous, and this painting shows all of her inner strength and snobism, and Orpen got it. Rapine, I could do slide after slide after slide for Rapine. Here's Tolstoy, here's Rimsky-Korsakov, here's Mussorgsky, and here's the great painter Stasov. And Sargent, the great Booth portrait, which we now have in Fort Worth, Henry James again, and when he was president of Princeton, Woodrow Wilson. And then this is Serov, and we have Levitan, the great painter, Rushoff, the writer, and Rimsky-Korsakov, again, the composer. And we have Sorolla with that marvelous portrait of William Howard Taft, one of the great American presidential portraits ever. And then two really wonderful portraits of a doctor, a famous doctor who was a very good friend of his in Madrid, and he's really interested in the representation of a scientist and the scientist and his machines. And these portraits had nothing to do with America, so they're not in the exhibition. Vuillard has the most famous art critic of the period, the most famous dentist of the period, and Madame Lanvin. That's Madame Lanvin by Vuillard. And Zorn has the president of the Swedish Academy, Antonin Proust, who was the Minister of Culture in France, and Isabella Stewart Gardner vamping it up in Venice in 1905. But what's riveting about these artists is that we think of them as portrait painters, and portraits were kind of lodestones around their necks. They had to paint portraits because that's how they made money. It's a little bit like Renoir. He's the only one of the Impressionists who had the same kind of career. But all of them painted other things, and the gathering of the other things would be a fascinating exhibition to do too. I'm showing you like 4 little exhibitions. Here are 2 still lifes and 1 genre scene by Jacques-Émile Blanche. And Jacques-Émile Blanche's still lifes are absolutely delicious. Boldini was the most nervous artist ever. It seems like every picture was kind of plugged in while he was painting it. It's kind of vibrating as you look at it. And here one sees a square in Paris, a street cafe in Paris, and a sort of Pygmalion-like sculpture in the gardens of Versailles who's going to get off that pedestal and dance amidst the dead leaves. And Mancini is a fascinating genre scenes and landscapes by Mancini. He was sadly into little boys, and so his career is littered with portraits of little boys. And Orpen was a great genre painter, and this is the Café Royal in London. This is people playing chess, and this is a studio still life, which again one would kill to own. And what I'm doing for you is to show you the extraordinary range and quality of these artists. So it's not just Sorolla. Sorolla was amongst the greatest of them, but he was among others. Here one has Rapine landscapes. If one wanted to do an exhibition of Sorolla landscapes, which I'm going to propose, you could also do a glorious exhibition of Rapine landscapes, Sargent landscapes, this is a city scene at the Clark, painted obviously in Venice, and here we are in the Alps, and here we are in Capri with John Singer Sargent, not painting portraits. And these are what Russians paint in the summer and the winter when they go to their country house, and these are all landscapes by Serov, which are as great as his portraits. So thinking outside of the normal confines, here we are non-portraits, here are Zorn non-portraits, and I don't know whether there is a more erotic nude, maybe the nude on the pink satin sheets by Sorolla, which Mark didn't ask for the exhibition because it was much too scandalous ever to come to America, but it's in Spain, and it could hang very well next to this Zorn, and you can see that Zorn was a very good dirty old man at the end of his life, and he loved painting buxom, glorious women in nature, of which there are many, 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 many representations, and these he painted for himself, not for money. Now, some of them were into themselves and into the ways in which they, as people generally from the lower middle classes, a couple of them even from the lower classes, and most of them from the middle classes, interacted in this world of society, of high multilingual society. This is Boldini. These are 3 portraits by Mancini, and there are more than 200 self-portraits by Mancini, who was almost as obsessed with himself as he was with paint, with little boys, and with beautiful women. Orpen self-portraits, there are 30 of them in oil, and they're amongst the greatest modern artists' self-portraits, and here are 2 of them. That hat is just, to die. It's called Me and Venus. And then Rapin is really wonderful because Rapin never paints himself. He paints the people who he loved rather than himself. And this is his wife on the left and his mom on the right. And there's never Rapin, not even in a mirror. Here is Seraph, Seraph's wife, and Seraph's kids. And Seraph is showing himself to us as a kind of peasant man, as an ordinary man, rather than a St. Petersburg man. Sargent virtually never painted himself. This is a painting of Helleu by Sargent and his wife, and this is Sargent painting to show that Sargent, unlike Mancini and unlike Orpen, was outer directed. Sorolla was not as focused on himself as were either Orpen or Mancini, but he exists in his paintings. And of course, one of the greatest of his paintings is the 1901 family picture on the right, where you see him in the mirror painting his wife and children who are in the shadows in front of him. A picture which is incredibly touching. And in fact, one could do a big exhibition devoted only to Sorolla and his family. Sorolla was, of all of these artists, the most happily married, the one who got the most satisfaction from his children, the one who waited to die until his grandson was born, and who had a kind of sense of living a normal life, which very few of these other artists did. And then, of course, the wonderful early self-portrait, and this, which we all know from the exhibition. Vuillard's self-portraits are also extraordinary, and I'm showing these because what's fascinating when you think about class rise in arts and artists who are fundamentally middle class, who exist within a realm of huge quantities of money, of high society, of travel, of luxury, of titles, of a kind of world that their parents could never even envision. And oftentimes what they do is they turn to themselves and to think about themselves throughout life as they're going through it. Here are wonderful self-portraits by Zorn, an etched self-portrait wearing a huge fur coat in the lower right just before he dies, and when he was young and handsome and still had a bit of hair up above, and the great fat middle-aged Zorn wearing the one color that you shouldn't wear if you're fat, which is red, and just loving it with the green tie and his cigarette and his kind of heavy-lidded, suspicious eyes. Now, when you talk about cosmopolitan artists, there's always a kind of anxiety on the part of those artists about where they come from, not just in a personal sense, but in a national sense. And my own country, my own place. And a few of them were very anxious about this and painted really important paintings. Not Jacques-Émile Blanche, not Helleu, not the Frenchman, because they lived in the place that they represented. But we have, this is William Orpen. This is one of the weirdest pictures of his career. It's called The Celtic Well. And it's a kind of imaginary representation of Celtic rituals in the ruins of ancient Ireland on the west coast of Ireland, painted by a man who lived in London in extraordinary splendor, but was anxious not only about himself, but about the world, the Irish world from which he came. Or Rapin, who was riveted by Russia, and who painted this, the religious procession in the province of Kyrgyz in 1883, which is his masterpiece, and which is even larger than this, and which is, if there is a kind of if all of Dickens is a portrait of England, and all of Flaubert is a portrait of France, and all of Balzac is a portrait of France, this is a portrait of Russia, because all aspects of Russian society are in this one painting coming towards us. The same with Serov, who painted extraordinary scenes from Russian history, the coronation of a czar. And Sargent, even Sargent, who spent almost no time in the country of which he was a citizen, the United States. He spent almost his entire life outside of it, but this, his greatest painting, represents other Americans in Paris. They're not at home, they're in Paris. And these three girls who led the most tragic lives, and Sargent actually got at that in painting this extraordinary picture in which he was thinking again about, guess who, Velázquez. And this painting was, extraordinarily enough, a couple of years ago, sent from Boston to the Prado, where it hung in the same room as Las Meninas, because it's the same size as Las Meninas. And this is true with Zorn. Zorn was riveted by Swedishness. Even though I speak all these languages, and even though I paint all these rich people in various places, I'm going to paint you girls sorting beer bottles in the beer place. I'm going to paint you peasants dancing. I'm going to paint you my Sweden. I'm going to be a Swede. Now, the Spain that's a little bit missing from Sorolla in America is the Spain of ordinary working people. And it would have been there more if we could have had the huge series of decorations mysteriously transplanted from the Hispanic Society to the Meadows Museum, which ain't gonna happen. And it also would have happened had Sorolla sent more of his very large portraits of Spanish ordinary people, Spanish peasants, Spanish fishermen, Spaniards making their meals, repairing their boats and nets, going sailing. This is a picture which is actually 4 times as big as this, which is in the Musée d'Orsay, and hangs in a place right before you go into the Impressionist galleries in the Musée d'Orsay, and is one of his greatest paintings that represents really nothing in particular, an ordinary boat, cattle pulling it in on the beach, the fishermen and others, and it monumentalizes the ordinary and the Spanish, or this glorious study of light and shade on the high seas. What to me is a big chapter that's left to be investigated, and maybe Mark and Blanca will pull themselves together and do these 2 exhibitions that I want them to do. And one of them is Sorolla landscapes, because Sorolla, there are a lot of landscapes in this exhibition, but he painted so many landscapes, and the percentage of successful ones is as high as any landscape painter in the history of art, and we don't think of him as a landscape painter. He sent many landscapes to America because he thought they would sell. He thought that difficult lower-class figural subjects wouldn't sell, and that landscapes would. And this is a picture owned by the Meadows, and this is a picture in Spain which I would kill to own. And as you can see, they both, this is this, and it's also this, and also this, and we're in this town where he painted as many as 25 or 30. Blanca was telling me, counting them, large scale, like Impressionist scale landscapes in the summer of 1906 or in the fall of 1906. Superb studies of earth and work and trees. And this is a picture which you look at initially, and then you look at this. And you think, oh my God, this is huge. And that's a human figure. And those trees are gigantic. And the walls are enormous. And we're in this place in which nature and what man has done to nature is unbelievably strong. Or one could go on a whole tour of Spain, but taking the landscapes of this great landscape painter, which in these landscapes could easily be taken out of and thought about as landscape paintings. Avila and other places in Spain. This is another picture I would kill for. We're standing way high up on a cliff in a mountain, looking down into one of those extraordinary white villages. And he doesn't trouble to paint anything exactly. It's as if our eyes are sort of scudding across the light-struck houses down below, and we can see the shadow of the mountain on which we stand right here. Or marvelous studies of trees. There are a whole series of pictures that take the vertical format and the vertical format of the forests of the north of Spain in varying colors. And then sometimes he'll paint a big, ambitious landscape that's based not on painting out of doors. This is a picture which is large and which was for exhibition and which was painted not out of doors but in the studio from other sketches, as if it's a portrait of the landscape. The seascapes are amazing. And again, there could be room after room after room of them, and there's hardly a bad one. I mean, if ever there was a study of a storm coming in at sea, and the scale of the things and the way that the brush moves in this dense gray blue, or this little kind of bouquet of sunstruck seacoast with light-colored rocks around it, or this, where we know where we are. Those of us who have been to San Sebastian, we know exactly where we are, and we know exactly what kind of a day it is. And it's scary to be there when the waves come roaring in and the storm comes in, and that hill across the way, and people are standing, looking down away from the beach on the wall at these extraordinary power of nature. Other times, at the same place, nature can be benign. And at other times, he can be George O'Keeffe. I mean, look at this. This is an extraordinary picture, and it's painted like that, and he knows not to muck it up. He knows not to add figures in the left corner and not to fiddle around with making differentiation in the water, because it works. It has this incredible power. Or this, in which water becomes paint, and the connection between water and paint is extraordinary. The other exhibition, and we can all feel this by going upstairs, is an exhibition of Sorolla drawings. Blanca, I remember Mark told me a few years ago when I had something to do with the Meadows that he was thinking of doing an exhibition of Sorolla drawings, and I kind of raised my eyebrows and thought, Sorolla drawings, who cares? I mean, this is one of the greatest painters ever. Who cares about his drawings? Well, all you have to do is go upstairs and see that room of drawings, and all you have to do is go to the Sorolla Museum, where there are over 2,000 uncatalogued drawings by Sorolla. And the quality of his drawings, he's up to Degas and Hermie Herschel, Liebermann, the great artists, graphic artists of the end of the 19th century. And this material is completely terra incognita. It's something for young scholars, and it could be an exhibition that one would really kill to see. When Sorolla looks at us now, as he did to his wife, he's looking to my Clotilde from Joachim, and he looks at her right in the eye, and he looks at us right in the eye, and he challenges us to think about the history of art in a different way than we usually do. Not simply as the national history of art. He didn't want simply to be a Spanish painter. He wanted to be a great painter, and his friends were Swedish and American and Italian and French, and he worked in a world which is represented in no single museum as it is and as it was in this lecture. And I thank you for your attention. Thank you. I was afraid it would be too long, so if anyone has questions, I'd be happy to answer. Yeah. I know, but he wasn't. So let's. I know. It was the title that I made up when I made up that title. The wonderful thing about being the speaker is you can speak about what you want to speak about. Sorry. So I should say why he wasn't an Impressionist. And he wasn't an Impressionist all the time. When he painted directly, they would have disliked his works of art because they were so facile and so quick. And they actually struggled for their impressions, and he did it easily. He did it in ways that Monet would have killed to have painted like Sorolla.
Who painted the guitar going in the right direction?
Boldini, yeah. It's the Spanish guitarist. There are a whole series of Spanish paintings, and there are a whole series of pointy guitars, too. Yeah.
How did you spell that? William Warpen?
Orpen, O-R-P-E-N, Orpen. And you need to go to, I mean, they're all in storage in British museums, and you have to go to Dublin to see them. And they're fantastic. And of course, the Meadows Museum can't do an Orpen exhibition. He couldn't even be an honorary Spaniard.